The history of Poland is seen through the cover of Time magazine. Welcome to this kickoff session of the Blanka Rosenstiel Lecture Series on Poland, brought to you by the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University and its European and Eurasian Studies program. I'm David Kramer, a senior fellow in the Václav Havel program on human rights and diplomacy and director of the European and Eurasian Studies program at FIU's Stephen J. Green School. The co-sponsors of today's event include the European and Eurasian Studies program, the American Institute of Polish Culture, the Honorary Consulate of the Republic of Poland in Miami, the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series, the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, and of course the European. Extend a special thanks to Blanka Rosenstiel for her generous support for this lecture series, and also to Beata Petrus and Lynn Schaefer at the American Institute for their partnership with us as well over the years. Poland has been at the center of many key historical events in the past century, whether as a victim of invasion during World War II or the subsequent imposition of a communist regime in Warsaw. The liberation from that regime through the Solidarity Movement, the home of Pope John Paul II, and other consequential developments. Dr. Mark Fountain, the Honorary Consul of Poland to North Carolina, has studied the occasions when Poland, in one way or another, has been featured on Time's cover and accordingly has pulled together a fascinating history that tells the story of many of Poland's different chapters. We're delighted to have you join us here today. And if we have him here, we might have the ambassador of Poland to the United States, Piotr Wilczek. Let me see if he is with us or not. I don't think we have him yet, so we'll try to bring him in when we're able to get him live and joining us. So without further ado, if I can, let me introduce Mark Fountain, who, as I said, is the Honorary Consul of the Republic of Poland in North Carolina. He was named to that position in 2008. He first came to know Poland in the spring of 1965 when he participated in a 6-week bus tour of East Central Europe and the government of West Germany. He earned his doctorate at Columbia University in New York in 1976, where he wrote his dissertation on the early political life of Roman Dmowski. In addition to his administrative career with the North Carolina Department of Transportation, he taught for 27 years at North Carolina State University. So Mark, we're delighted to have you with us. I'm going to turn this over to you, and I know you have a slide presentation to share with us. Thanks very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and my many thanks to Beata Petrus and to Blanka Rosenstiel, who is the Mäzenas of so many things concerning Poland around the United States. What you see here on your screen right now, I decided to use this particular cover. It's not a particular Pole who's on the cover. The obvious large figure in front is Khrushchev. This is a Time magazine cover from October the 3rd, 1960. And it's a marvelous evocation of the caricaturist's, cartoonist's art. The cartoonist, as you see at the bottom right of that cover, is Herb Bloch. Herb Bloch had an incredible ability to capture the essence of a particular individual or a particular time. In this case, it is a visit to the United Nations. You see the Cenotaph building there in the background in September of 1960. You'll remember that the cover dates are approximately 1 week after the actual printing date. So always keep in mind that the subject of the cover had done something in the weeks before that, at least 1 week before. So what you see here is an evocation, as I said, of several topical items. First of all, Bernstein's West Side Story had just been filmed. Was still a big item on Broadway. So this is a play on that. We have the East Side Rockets rather than the West Side in this case. They're a batch of gang members, if you will, being led by Khrushchev. And the presentations of the other individuals here are rather remarkable. I'll point out first, because most of you in Miami will know Fidel Castro, who's running along as a sort of cadet person trying to get into the picture. But I'll start on the left with Tito. Tito is an outsider. He's not part of the gang. He's looking to see what will happen. And then we have, moving from left to right, we have Gomulka, slightly bald-headed like me. And then we have several others. We have Kadar, we have Novotny, Georgy Georgievdej, Todorjivkov, and practically hidden behind all the others is Enver Hoxha from Albania. So a wonderful evocation, and I will come back to the arts there. I see, David, that the ambassador is with us. Do you want to put him on now?
Sure. Okay. No, that's kind of you, Mark. So let me turn it over to Ambassador Piotr Wilczek, Poland's ambassador to the United States. Mr. Ambassador, sorry for the mix-up on the link, but we're delighted you can join us, and please go ahead, and then we'll come back to Mark's presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can. Go right ahead.
Yes, Mark, I'm very sorry. I just got the wrong link, as a member of the audience, not as a speaker. So I was, listening to the whole event from the very beginning, but just couldn't join you and speak to you. So sorry, Mark, for interrupting. And so I will speak very briefly. I'm very happy to be again at Florida International University. This time, unfortunately, remotely from Washington, D.C. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the virtual inauguration of this year's Blanka Rosenstiel Lecture Series on Poland. I was delighted to be, I think a year ago at FYU, also with David Kramer, with Lady Blanka, with Beata Paszyc. We had a great panel on Poland. So I'm so happy to be with everyone at FIU, with all members of the audience. I'm confident that the discussions that will soon take place will prove to be an invaluable opportunity to deepen our knowledge on Poland. So Mark has already started his lecture about Poland in Time magazine covers. This lecture, I understand, will examine the many chapters of Poland's long history as told by the covers of this publication. Pivotal events in world history are inspired both by great individuals as well as great social movements. These covers and this seminar are reflections of that sentiment. The distinguished Poles featuring over time in this magazine, including St. John Paul II or Solidarity leader Anna Walentynowicz, are key figures that have shaped the course of world history and Polish-American relations. Thanks to internationally recognized outlets such as Time magazine, their legacies traveled far beyond the borders of Poland and are now forever etched into our common history. These individuals also stood at the helm of larger social movements, such as Solidarity of the 1980s, whose 40th anniversary, as you know, we celebrate this year. Solidarity was a mass peaceful movement that helped to release Central and Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union's communist grip. St. John Paul II, one of the most prominent sons of Poland, was instrumental during that time in encouraging the Polish people to pursue their right to self-determination. Thus, these covers are also an homage to the masses that stood behind these figures and dared to strive for the right to freedom and self-determination. Poland's coverage will not stop there, of course. We are currently witnessing what is arguably the best era in Poland-US relations. From our continuously expanding defense cooperation within NATO to the planned joint construction of Poland's civil nuclear energy sector in cooperation with the United States, there are many positive developments to look forward to. Future generations of Poles and Polish Americans, too, will no doubt distinguish themselves in a manner befitting a Time magazine cover. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak with today's audience. I'm delighted to be today at Florida International University. I'm very happy to see David now on the screen. Many thanks to Blanka Rosenstiel for her continued efforts to support the Polish program at FIU, and to Beata Paszyc, who is such a passionate organizer of all these events. So I'll continue listening to Mark, and sorry again for interrupting, but it was a technical problem. I should be off in 20 minutes. I'm going to a meeting to the White House today. So, but thank you again, and it's great to be with you. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thanks so much. We really are grateful for your partnership with FIU and the Green School over the years, and delighted you could join us. I'm glad we were able to get you on, and thank you so much. And we understand that you'll need to leave early. Mark, appreciate your flexibility. These are the times we live in where we roll with the punches. So back over to you, and thanks again, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, I must say that I don't look upon this as having to roll with the punches. I can assure you that Ambassador Wilczek is a very busy man, and I'm willing to step aside in a heartbeat to let him get on with his job. He visited us here in Raleigh a year or two back. We went to the governor's office, we went to SAS, we went to the Economic Development Council, etc., and all over the triangle, and there are 25 miles or so between all these various points. In the car, he and Katarzyna Czop were constantly working as we went from meeting to meeting for the whole weekend. It's truly remarkable. Professor Dr. Wilczek, he is an historian, by the way, so I'm walking on thin ice here. He will have to correct me, perhaps. So if we can move forward one slide, I think we've exhausted our East Side rockets. The only last thing I might say about that, again, on topicality, time is always, there are little items here. This is just before the election of 1960, Nixon-Kennedy, and the Democrats had made a great deal over what was called the missile gap. So this East Side rockets has a very definite point, a little satirical dig at the campaign. Okay, quickly here, inspiration for the paper. We won't spend a lot of time here. I was named Honorary Consul in 2008 by the then Ambassador Robert Kupiecki. Piotr Wilczek, who is now the head of the political section in Washington, came down with him. A very significant event, and I always want to pay a debt to Professor Dr. Andrzej Rabchenko, now in retirement outside Warsaw, for the many favors that he has done me over the years. And if you'll look at the very bottom right, Mariusz Bremora, who was cultural attaché at this particular time, was really quite a remarkable man. One or two quick items here. The small lady to my left is my wife, who is a concert pianist and a great lover of Poland. That's how we came to meet. The 15 covers that I had in 2008 were hung rather ingeniously by Hanka Gracz. So you can see my collection as it stood at that time. It is now larger. Next slide, if you will, please, here. It should be the first cover that ever featured a Pole on Time magazine. And you can see here that I put his Polish name up here, Józef Konrad Korzeniowski, on the bottom of the, or at the bottom of the Time cover itself. You will see his English name, Joseph Conrad, for which he became famous. So this is volume 1, number 6. Therefore, there were only 5 covers on Time magazine before a Pole showed up, right from the very beginning. The title of the inside story was A Great Novelist to Visit the United States, etc., etc. Almost everyone in the US of my age, at least, is familiar with Joseph Conrad, Nostromo, Heart of Darkness, Secret Share, etc. We'll spend more time on the political cover, so if we can move forward to the next one, please. The next one is shortly thereafter. And again, we don't have a Pole, or not at all Polish in this case, but his connection to Poland is rather extraordinary. This is our first ambassador to the newly resurrected Polish state in 1918-19, and a great lover and defender of Poland in practically every way. The issue you can see here is November the 26th. Therefore, these are events in the first 2 weeks of November. And there was at that time a great deal of unrest in Krakow. There were actually very large street demonstrations. There was violence. And the reason for all of this was that in the extraordinary year of 1923, this huge inflation was not only in Germany, and this Rentenmark, which practically everyone in history knows about, had just been introduced. So a little bit of order was becoming evident in Germany, except for this last item at the very bottom here. You can see that the beer hall putsch and Hitler by name is the second time in Time magazine that Hitler's name shows, an indication again of the great unrest. But also in Poland, there was inflation. Most people are not familiar with the Polish situation, but during World War I, the Germans had put in their currencies. They were in charge of the central areas of Poland, and their Austrian allies were in charge of the southern part. So this Polish mark had been introduced already before the end of the war. Therefore, there needed to be a currency reform in Poland. So Władysław Grabski was the guru, if you will, of currencies and introduction. This was done over a period of about 6 months, from November up into April of 1924, because the introduction of a new currency is a very sensitive matter. Trust is everything in a currency. So it had to be done carefully, not too much, not too fast, not too little, not too slow, has to be done. So let's move on to the next slide. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. Now, everyone recognizes this gentleman. This green strip on the left, by the way, is not on my copy. This is from the publications by Time magazine. There were about 10 covers that had this experimental what's inside, so to speak, strip along the left. So this was one of those 10 covers in 1926. And again, you can see here exactly why he appears on the cover at this instant. The coup d'etat of May 12, 1314 in Warsaw against the legally constituted, duly constituted government of Poland had just taken place. So this, quite often described as benign paternalistic dictatorship, had just been inaugurated. It wasn't all that benign at the very beginning. There were street battles in Warsaw, Poniatowski Bridge, all of this. Several hundred died, somewhere between 300 and 400 men and others died. So from this point on, this paternalistic dictatorship undergoes a gradual shift to the right. Piłsudski, who was a socialist, but always of the national variety, the famous story of the streetcar that he's riding along, the streetcar of socialism, and he got off at the stop marked Poland. So he's a socialist of some time. Dmowski, by the way, Roman Dmowski, on whom I wrote my doctoral dissertation, once kidded him vastly about this, calling him a strange socialist. That's really, I can't get off on all of these things, sorry. This is historian's disease. There's so many stories that come in on the side here. So this paternalistic dictator, the same, the parliament is still in evidence, but gradually we come up with a party which is created out of nothing to support the government. So the BBVR, Bezpartijny Blok Współpracy z Rządem is the full thing. the non-party bloc of cooperation with the government. So again, a major cover. Dropped his book, seized his saber, is the sobriquet down at the very bottom of this particular cover. Moving on to the next one. We won't take quite as much time on this because Paderewski is more a pianist than he is a politician. And the reason for this cover appearing at this particular moment was that he was beginning his 16th concert tour of the United States. It's not even the first after World War I, which comes in 1921 too. He is a politician to some degree. During World War I, he had worked together with the Polish National Committee in Paris, which was by and large in opposition to Piłsudski, because Piłsudski and his group were supporters of an Austrian solution. So there was always some tension in here. So Paderewski, though, by his international stature, gained access. Access is always important in any political development or any commercial development for that matter. So he comes to Paris to straighten out some of the problems that Dmowski's abrasiveness had created, and signed together with him the Versailles Treaty on June the 28th, 1919. He had been named. He went back to Poland. He left New York in November. He arrived in Poznań December 27th, I believe it is, 1918. Wielkopolskie, Powstanie Wielkopolskie, the uprising in Wielkopolska, which threw off the Prussian overlordship. So in 1919, the 16th of January, he was named prime minister and concurrently foreign minister because he was acceptable more or less to both sides. Quite often, Paderewski is linked with Roman Dmowski. They were not that close. I want to emphasize this. There were tensions there. Dmowski felt that Paderewski got in the way, that he was too soft-hearted, that he distracted from the points that Dmowski hammered all the time. And of course, he was unacceptable to Piłsudski because of his overall association with the Komitet Narodowy Polski. Next slide, please. So he was bounced out then, is what I'm saying, in December of 1919, after only 11 months. Okay, another side issue, a musician, and I won't spend a great deal of time on this. This is 1930. You can see Leopold Stokowski, or Stokowski as he's always known in the United States. Stokey in some cases, conductor of the famous Philadelphia Symphony. And you can see here an example down at the bottom of the cover here, the names. They string out a whole batch of made up Polish names. Leopold Anton Stanisław Bolesław Stokowski. And he was practically none of these, only the Leopold really goes there. His mother was very definitely English. It was his grandfather who had immigrated to England. So he's about as, well, he's a little more Polish than I am, but not much. So, and he affected an accent. At one time, by the way, just to show you that almost everyone in the arts will seek to augment his stage presence, he was married to Olga Samarov. Well, Olga Samarov sounds wonderfully Russian, but she was actually a Southern white Anglo-Saxon Protestant like me, born in Galveston, Texas, and growing up in Dallas. And her name was Lucy Mary Agnes Hickenlooper. She was a great pianist, but Hickenlooper and Lucy and Agnes, or whatever you can come up with of those three extra names, didn't have the stage presence of something Russian. So there we are. Leonard Bernstein was not the first to be a showman. Next slide, if we will. Okay, here's Paderewski again. After, this is 1939. And again, the reason for this is not political, but musical. It was the start of his 20th and last tour. He's 78 years old. He was born in 1860 after all. But there is a slight item here, a hint of politics as well. This is the fourth point I have here, Front Morge, Sikorski. These were prominent Poles who were in opposition to the epigoni, the followers, because Piłsudski had died in 1935. Poland from May 12th on, that's the anniversary, by the way, of his coup d'etat, beginning of his coup d'etat. He died on the 9th anniversary of his coup d'etat. This Front Morge is the beginnings of the Polish exile government during World War II. And Paderewski was again a figurehead for that government until his death in 1941, a rallying point for Poland. Next issue, if you will, one much more overtly political. Next cover, can we move David or whoever? There we go. Again, I believe that most of you, certainly those familiar with Poland, will recognize this gentleman. This is the foreign minister of Poland. At this point, March of 1939, everything was beginning to heat up. The invasion of Poland by the Germans, Nazis, was going to be 6 months later. The overheated events of August and then the attack itself on September the 1st, 1939. Beck is a somewhat controversial figure. He's one of these colonels, as they're called, one of the epigones of Piłsudski. And this is the period after the Munich conference and the riving off of the Sudetenland, which rendered Czechoslovakia completely vulnerable, which had come about in September, October of 1938. One of the problems that existed here is that the Poles at this particular time, seeing that Czechoslovakia was being dismembered, decided to take a little area that had been under contention all the way back in 1918, 1920. Zaolzie, the area behind the Olzie River, Teschen in German, Teschen in Czech. And from this point on, the Poles have always been denigrated for having taken part in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. But the story is older than that. It may be interesting to see Teschen as a town, has a little river through it. One side is Poland, one side is Czech today. So his policy, though, to go back to this, was of keeping Germany and the Soviet Union apart in every way, neither allies nor enemies, so that there would not be any cooperation between them or fallout from their working together. And of course, this failed, not necessarily his fault. The die was cast in August 23rd of 1939. Next slide, if we may here. This is, again, one of the colonels, one of the more interesting ones, actually, Śmigły Rydz, or Rydz Śmigły. Śmigły is his sort of underground nickname. And this is the issue, as you can see here, September 11th, 1939, went to press on September the 3rd or 4th, and the war had broken out on the 1st of September, 2 days before. So this is obvious that as the subject of attack. The Soviets are not in it yet. They don't come in until the 17th. So he is fighting a war of retreat at this particular moment. Now, interestingly enough, he was not a military man to begin with. He was a student of the Akademia Sztuk Pięknych, the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow, an artist. He was a good caricaturist, sketching, watercolors, the whole gamut, and a student of some of the best of the faculty at the Academy of Fine Arts. He had joined back in 1980, at the age of 22, the Związek Walki Czynnej of Piłsudski, so he was one of his oldest collaborators. successor to Piłsudski in 1935, but he didn't have the clout and the weight even within his own party. So among the colonels, he was first perhaps, but not the only one. Discredited in general because of the failure of his policies. He was out into Romania and then by subterranean secret means returned to Poland under the name of Adam Zawisza at the end of 1941 and died shortly thereafter, as I understand from several of my friends, of a heart attack. Zawisza, by the way, is something of a favored name in Poland. In the early 15th century, Zawisza Czarny, Black Zawisza, was a participant in the Council of Constance, at which the Poles defended the rights of all humans, even those non-Christians, heathens, so to speak, to, in this case, it was Jan Hus, to human rights. It's a favorite subject for my good friend Andrzej Radchenko. Next slide, if we will. Again, we come up with someone who's partly Polish, but she's the daughter of Maria Skłodowska-Curie, Polish-French, but spent her entire life, practically speaking, in 1940. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on her, but she's Polish, at least half Polish, and obviously was always interested in Polish affairs and presented them even for that matter. This issue comes in February of 1940, which is before the invasion of France. So this subtitle, All the Men and Women of Genius Are With Us, that means that everyone is united against the Nazi Germany at this particular point. She later became war correspondent all over Soviet, Central Asia, etc. She was married in 1954 to a man, Richard Henry Labuisse, with North Carolina connections. I have to mention where I'm seated at the moment here. And oddly enough, in 1962, when I was a senior in high school, I interviewed for what's called a Moorhead Scholarship at the University of North Carolina. And this gentleman, her husband, Labuisse, was on the committee, the finals committee that named the ones who were actual winners. And I was lucky enough to have that. So I owe a debt by in-laws or whatever. Next slide, though, I'll digress too much here. Here's Stokowski again, and I'll just say only one thing about this. This is because of Fantasia and Mickey Mouse. The famous Fantasia film by Disney came out at exactly this moment. So the subtitle here at the bottom beneath his name, which is not satirized this time, you see. He's almost an elder musical statesman by this time. So they put him up as Leopold Stokowski. And nothing too hard. He was famous by this time for the Philadelphia sound, it's called. This carpet-like quality, smoothness, beauty, etc. Next slide, if we will. Now, this one we have to spend a little more time on. And before the ambassador or others hit me with this, about 3 hours ago this morning, I was looking through, there's one major item here that's in error. 1, 2, 3, 4, it's the 5th point, failed, Chirazitak. It's the summer of 1946. In my defense, may I say that 6 and 7 are the same finger on the keyboard. It's certainly the summer of 1946, which has to do a great deal with the elections of January 1947. So it's an egregious mistake, whether it was a slip of the finger or not. This is Stanisław Mikołajczyk. Again, something of a controversial figure. Almost all Poles are controversial, certainly among their friends and fellow countrymen. They're always being criticized from one side or another, or from all sides. So here we have him. Again, this is not a photograph. I prefer the covers that are not photographs, because the artist will come up with some traits and some features, plus the background here that we'll hit in just a moment, that are truly telling. And you need to look at every item on the cover. You will see here that this map of Poland, just to the right and below his left ear there, has the old interwar territories in the east, the territories from the Treaty of Riga in 1921, and it includes most of the territories in the west, but not all of it. It's not all the way up to the Oder-Neisse line yet, or Oder-Nisse. So there, it includes both the territories they're going to get from Germany, including, even for that matter, the upper part of the Königsberg, Kaliningrad area that eventually went to the Soviet Union, or the RSFSR for that matter, not just the Union. So this is a map that includes Poland as large as you could ever imagine it in the post-World War era. You will also see that there is a red star at the upper part on the very edge of the color presentation, and it shines a light on this map. Again, look at everything you see that some caricaturist or painter does. There are little sneaky items, indications that come in here. I say sneaky, they're subtle. Let's put it that way. In this case, it's the red star, obviously a reference to the Soviet Union. It's shining on this map to illuminate it or perhaps put heat on it. You remember, stars are hot as well as showing light. Mika Wojcik had been in the London exile government during the war, and in summer of 1945, he agrees to join the communist counter-government out of Lublin, which is formed in 1944, July 22nd. So he attempts to go back and with his peasant party to work as best he could and moderate as best he could what was obviously going to be a difficult time and a hard-driving communist or Polish worker party effort to take over the country. The peasant and the Tommy gun, there's a story inside here about a woman with a machine gun, submachine gun on the Poniatowski Bridge, or what was left of the Poniatowski Bridge, blocking the way and being ready to use this Tommy gun on whoever might be in the way. A marvelous cover. This one is one of my favorites. Next slide, please, if you will. This one goes a little faster. Again, a musician, Artur Rodzinski, no politics at all here, 1947. But again, my wife being a musician, a New England Conservatory of Music, lover of Chopin. She has a recital, by the way, on Sunday, an all Chopin program that we have to get ready for. So I'm obligated to speak of musicians. In this case, he had just resigned over disagreements with the management of the New York Philharmonic. Great conductor, not a politician. Next slide, though. We move forward. You can see here quite a leap, 9 years plus. And everyone knows this gentleman here. We saw him already in the cartoon from 1960 that we started with. This is December the 10th. The Polish October of 1956 is justly famous. So Władysław Gomułka. The subtitle in the article itself, Poland Rebellious Compromiser. He is the rebellious compromiser, he Gomułka. He's a rebel in the sense that he is a national communist. He had been imprisoned by his party. It's the final step in the Communist Party takeovers. There's a coalition government that's vaguely real. In other words, it contained Mika Wojcik. After January 1947 and these truly fraudulent elections, Mika Wojcik has to flee the country. And then we get bogus coalition governments, so only figureheads that were not truly representative of their party. And then finally, we have to get rid of, well, next we get to the amalgamation of the Social Democrats, PPS, to make the Polish United Workers' Party. And finally, we throw out men like Gomułka who were in Poland in the underground movement during World War II, not in Moscow, and who were suspicious to Stalin. So his imprisonment was the last step in putting everything in lockdown. 49 to 53, everything is in lockdown. Stalin dies on March 5th, 1953. It's just before my 9th birthday. I remember it. The thaw ensues. Bierut, Bolesław Bierut, and others are then in charge, and there's a period of ferment. The 20th Party Congress takes place in Moscow. This is the Russian Bolshevik Party. Bierut doesn't make it through that. He dies of a heart attack because of Khrushchev's famous speech on February the 20th. And he literally dies of a heart attack. I remember seeing a newspaper in the Columbia University Library at one point. Bierut nie żyje. Bierut doesn't live. That's what it means. Bierut has died. So he didn't make it back. It was such a shock to his system. And thereafter, there's a great deal of ferment. In June of 1956, these are items that, as the pips go down, we move through the year 1956. In Poznań, the workers from the Cegielski works, which at that time were named for Stalin, these are locomotive and railway, streetcar, passenger car factory. Then they march and we get tanks that are brought in to put down the uprising. When you go to Poznań, you can see all of this. So national communism, hopes, everyone was hopeful. You see on the cover here that there are Polish flags in great numbers in the background. And that is telling because he's Polish. He puts Poland before international communism or before Russia. And that was why he was suspect. But he's still a committed member of the Communist Party. So some of these hopes for multi-party government or multi-party system, freer elections, etc., were never really a part of this. And as a demonstration of this, in 1945 or 1947-8, he was in charge of what's called the recovered territories in the West. Silesia, Pomerania, eastern edge of Mecklenburg, etc. Hard-nosed, committed to his membership in the Communist Party. Next slide, please. Oh my, we're running long. And again, a great fait accompli by the editors of Time magazine. A short while later, we get a picture of his main opponent, Poland's Cardinal Wyszynski, Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski. And you'll see here once again that we have an indication in the background. This is the Polish eagle with a crown. The church never got rid of the crown. The Communist Party obviously didn't like that. And so the church, this is a symbol again of the national nature of the Polish Catholic Church. Cardinal and the Commissar. Time was on the side of the church more than the party. That's why I have the 4th dot there. Pope Gregory's been around. The church didn't last for 1,500 years after Gregory for being prone to flying off the handle. The church always steps back, absorbs the blow, looks at what its best course may be, and then follows that. And there's a greater permanence there than there is, let's say, in the 50 years since the beginning of Russian radicalism in 1905 with Father Gapon. I'll mention growing rifts within the United Workers' Party. There are Muscovites on the one side and the Armia Ludova on the other. And then the additional item of careerists and the nomenclatura. Next slide, we've really got to move here. I'm running long. This is Polański Nóż w wodzie. Polański is not mentioned in this, 1963, Religion of Film, the auteur era right in here. It's filmed at Polański's age 28, best foreign language film, etc. And we'll mention here Jerzy Kosinski on the side because, again, there was a good deal of ferment in this as people realized that there was intellectual life in East Central Europe overall. But Polanski's not mentioned. His film is more important than he is at this particular moment. And I think that's something that needs to be pointed out. He only supersedes his films later. Okay, next slide. Rubinstein, we won't spend a great deal of time on him. I thought to say something about the city of Łódź, where he was born, which pre-1939 was a unique city in Poland, 1/3 German, 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Polish, subject of Władysław Stanisław Reymont, Nobel Prize winner in 1925, I believe. But we can't digress that far. Wonderful man, great pianist, a lover of Poland. His return to play a concert in Poland was an event of extraordinary proportion. Next slide, if you will. We've got to move. 1978, this is Karol Wojtyła name, totally unexpected. It's like a little breath. When a front moves through, a weather front, quite often you get a little puff of wind, barely perceptible. And you know that a storm is coming, that a low front is moving in, and that there's likely to be unsettled weather. So in this case, it's politically in Poland, it sinks into the party and others that something remarkable has happened. And indeed, it is a galvanizing event for the general population, but it is not unique. The KOR, Komitet Obrony Robotników, is already in 1977, before this, and Gierek's economic experiment had failed. So economically, the hard times were coming. Okay, next slide. We've really got to move here. The party was unable to keep Pope John Paul II from coming back. And you can see this is barely half a year later, maybe 2/3. His physical presence is remarkable. He goes to Częstochowa, which is famous for this siege in which the Poles resisted the Swedish invasion of 1654. So there's great symbolic importance here. 1 million or more come by foot. Now in the United States, where the Catholic population is obviously quite significant, but the Protestants and others outnumber Catholics easily. The importance of pilgrimages may not be fully appreciated, but the exaltation that is induced by walking 50 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles. If you go to Spain, northern Spain, to Compostela, you will see people walking and they're 75, 100 miles out and they're heading for Compostela. The same thing here in Poland in 1979. We reference to 68 here. Let's go on to the next slide, though we can't stay forever. September the 1st, this is the Polish August of 1980 Solidarity Conference in Gdańsk. This is the gate to the Stocznia Gdańska, the shipyard, very famous. Again, always look carefully at this. The gate, if you will gauge this by the height of the individual workers, and remember, they're not tall, they're not the product of some aristocratic background, so they're not tall. They haven't had a good, easy food flow for generations, so they're not heavy for that matter. Look carefully at even photographs, not just caricatures and paintings, but photographs, and see what you can derive from this. The workers are not monumental. There's a revolt from below. We get here for the first time Lech Wałęsa. If you ever go here, there is now a museum. It doesn't have the immediacy of the actual original hall that these decisions were worked out in. Next slide, if you will. Here's Lech Wałęsa. This is December 29th, 1980. And you can see here, it's a drawing once again, red and white background, the colors of Poland, the flag, shaking up communism. This is a year before martial law, now mind you, this is December 1980. It's 10 years after the original appearance by Wałęsa in December 1970, when Gomulka was finally turned out. Everything needs focus, concentration, the role of the individual as an epitome, someone who personifies a particular movement. Heavy smoke, environment, wind drift, acid rain. The factories in the communist bloc were dirty. And in Saxony and East Germany, they were especially dirty. And the west wind drift would blow all of these acid rain producing clouds of smoke over Krakow. And it was starting to melt away some of the statues in front of the Peter Paul Church. Tanks were at the ready. At the bottom here, you can see underneath Poland's Lech Wałęsa, you can see that there's Our Lady of Częstochowa, very small icon item down there. So tanks, pollution, solidarity, the whole gamut are right there on that cover. Reagan had just been elected. This is the election of 1980. So, or first week of November 1980, Reagan was elected. So we have a hardening of the Cold War. So next slide. We can move rather quickly. This is, again, a famous individual. December the 28th, 1981, the government had just pulled all the telephone lines out of the wall, locked down December the 13th. So economic stagnation, my statement I made one time was that everyone was working 2 jobs on paper, and no one was working 40 hours. My experience of the black market in the summer of 1984 was that the official rate at 1 to 7 was quite different from the unofficial rate on the street of 1 to 20. And I want to emphasize also the third point here, economic stagnation and an exodus. The biggest exodus of solidarity people came a little later, but they had been bleeding all through the late 1970s and the first couple of years of the 1980s. By 1s and 2s and 3s, the best young talent in Poland was leaving the country. So, okay, next slide, if we will, Man of the Year. And you can see that this cover follows by only 1 week, 7 days, the cover for Jaruzelski, embodiment of the resistance, etc. He's not perfect. He's the butt of jokes for the educated classes in Poland, i.e. the nomenklatura. His grammar and pronunciation, peasant expressions and all are grating to just about everyone. In 2008, I was privileged to sit with Andrzej Rotomund of the Royal Castle at a table in the Citadel for a dinner, and Wałęsa gave a speech at that banquet. And Rotomund and his wife would visibly wince from time to time, listening to Lech Wałęsa. It's a class question, if you will, here. A man very, very influential. Next slide, please. Once again, 5 years had passed since his first visit. We won't spend any time with this, except to say at the bottom of my list here, things begin to shift about 1983-45, because things are shifting in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev comes in 1985, and at that point, it's world affairs outside Poland proper that begin to influence affairs inside Poland. Next slide. And now we go boom, 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 boom. By the way, there are intermediate covers of Time magazine that have little tabs. If you look over here at the World War II cover, 50th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, at the top right, you see Solidarność Poland Today. There are 15 or more covers that have little tabs like this that I have not included in this program because we're already running long. But this one triggers a little item here. We're at the very end by this time. Elections have taken place back in June. We get to this August 28th cover, we get the November the 6th cover, and which has nothing immediately to do with Poland. This middle one here, it's a Hungarian flag that you see there. The Iron Curtain, so to speak, opened up first in Hungary, not in Poland. Poland is separated by Czechoslovakia and East Germany from the West. So it's Hungary that has the common border with a Western nation, Austria. So it started there and then mushroomed. And all the Trabis and other East German cars, these little cars, were driven down to Hungary and abandoned along the border, and people crossed on foot. And then the wall comes down on November the 9th. Boom, 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 boom. Over here on the right, I have the question, did it fall or was it pushed? My position has always been that there was constant pressure on the Berlin Wall from the side of the Poles. And when it fell, it probably took only a puff of wind. It was just a momentary hesitation on the part of the Stasi and on the part of Walter Ulbricht and all of these gentlemen in East Germany to a moment only, and then boom, it's gone. Next slide, if you will. This is, we can make it our last slide, really. There are another one or two here. This is an illustration of how I use these framed covers. They're framed entire, by the way. This is a 2012 cultural booth. That's yours truly in his Krakow outfit with his, I'm like Leopold Stokowski as well, and Leonard Bernstein. I got rid of my original peacock feathers and bought 4 that were much taller than the original. So I'm a showboat as well, you can see here. So this was a booth. The theme that year was Turning Points in History. I chose the election in June, 4th of June, 1989. You can see the Solidarność, famous Solidarność high noon poster right there. Panel on the left, first panel is World War II and aftermath. And the 4 time covers above that are Śmigły-Rydz, Mikołajczyk, and the Gomulka and Wyszynski covers from 1956. Then the second panel is the church as a second center of power. Remember, this is the great, trump card of the Poles, if you will. Unlike Russia, the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church, which is rather passive politically, the Roman Catholic Church is very active politically, especially in Poland, and has been for centuries. 1569, Posavino, all of these fellows, Staszic in 1791, etc. So I use that to demonstrate this tension from the 70s to 81. Jaruzelski, the back panel, we get the martial law period, the round table, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the far right, if you will look over there above the little girl in the peasant outfit there, you can see there are no time covers, not one. We haven't had a real time cover since this World War II one here as such. And that's an indication that things are running pretty well. There's no huge crisis on in Poland right at this moment. I'll call your attention to one last thing. I did this whole upper level. It's my work. 2 ladies brought in the items that you see sitting on the floor at the left and at the right. The items on the floor left are ruins meant to signify the ruins of Warsaw in 1945 in January, after the uprising had been quelled in August, September, and the whole town had been burnt out. So that's a bit of realia brought in by some of the ladies of the club. Over on the right here, you'll see a suitcase. This is a suitcase. Draped over that is the prison garb belonging to a friend of mine. Who spent time in prison, refused to come out when the amnesty was offered because he said he had broken no law no general law of mankind, and that to accept the amnesty would be to admit some guilt that he did not have. So this was brought in by his wife, who had gone to the authorities and promised them to take him out of the country if they would throw him out the doors of the prison. So I tell you what, gentlemen, as always, I have run long. David, I apologize to you. I told you it would happen. So Q&A as long as you may wish. I'll do my best.
Well, Mark, thanks so much. I didn't want to jump in and say we're running out of time because it was too fascinating, frankly. It was just an amazing presentation. We don't have much time. We probably just have about 5 minutes or so because we're a little over already. But let me just ask you, the idea to look at Poland's history through this prism, how did it come to you?
It came to me because I've always been very visual in everything that I do. I want to go to the places where things happened, so I can feel the atmosphere. You know, when I saw the film Patton, for example, and that whole sequence in North Africa, where he goes back to the classical era, and he says, these warriors have been here before me. I have something of that same viewpoint. So I'm always looking at the visual, what can be seen.
And looking back on the history that you've described, and you fast forward to today, Poland, like any country, is having challenges and some problems, but as you said, it has not been on the cover in a long time. And yet we have US troops stationed in Poland. Poland is a member of NATO. Poland is a member of the European Union. Poland is free from Soviet and / Russian influence. It must be pretty remarkable that Poland has reached this point.
It's truly remarkable. November the 9th, I had been out to a meeting, a dinner meeting, and I got back at 11 o'clock. And as I was hanging my coat up, the evening news, 11 o'clock news was on. And the NBC commentator was saying, and I heard it rather than saw it at that instant. He says, and standing on top of the Berlin Wall behind me are dozens, even hundreds of citizens of East and West Berlin. And it just rocked me back, because when I was in Göttingen, which is how I came to Poland first in 1965 with a West German group, university students, we had in our international house a former FOPO, people's policeman, who had jumped over the barbed wire, not the famous one, not Schumann, but another one. He jumped over the wire as the barbed wire was being rolled out the first day of the Berlin Wall, before the masonry went up. So I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. And there it was, tangible. So yes, Poland is still between Germany and Russia. Germany is rather quiescent, all things considered. Russia's a bit of a problem. There's a great deal of fluidity. Poland and Hungary are, these things repeat themselves. Poland and Hungary will almost always act together. They are friends. The Czechs will always be somewhat outside. Remember, your neighbor is not necessarily your friend. You're likely to have friction with your neighbor. I mean, you're abutting one another. Your tree falls in his yard, his tree falls in your yard. You're likely to have problems. So neighbors are not necessarily friends. But there's this sort of emerging paternalism, if you will, on the side of the Poles toward Ukraine and toward Belarus. They would like to have it with Lithuania as well, but the Lithuanians have always stood somewhat aside. But because all those areas were once a part of Poland, there's a sort of obligation, or sensed obligation on the part of Poles that Ukraine is something they're supposed to be responsible for, and Belarus as well.
So we got a few questions that came in from our viewers, Mark. So let me try to run through these quickly. We won't have a lot of time to do them, but David Skip asks, any feel for how the time covers affected American opinion, American perceptions of Poland?
I'm less competent in that particular era, but certainly the enthusiasm for the solidarity movement, and as I said, it appeared on quite a number of covers as a tab down or whatever. It was kept constantly before the public, and then the obvious role of Pope John Paul II. In all of this, because of the large Polish population in the United States and the large Catholic population in the United States, was always in the forefront. World War II is a little harder to say. In fact, one thing that stands out with me, and I cannot ever quite forgive Time magazine for this, the Ghetto Uprising of 1943. There's no cover. The Warsaw Uprising itself in August, September of 1944, no cover. Now you can explain that away to some degree by saying that we were concentrating on the war in Europe, which is basically Western Europe, invasion of southern France in the summer of 44, cross-channel invasion slightly earlier in the same summer. It's all out there, and that was where the concentration was, because that's where the sons and others were, or in the Pacific, where members of my family were also. So maybe you can say it, but things as significant. Jan Karski brings out in 1942 all the words, all the information about the death camps and other camps. The Polish government had already in 1940 put out vast amounts of information on what was heating up in Poland, and excess deaths, if you will. This absence of information is a problem. And then in the post-war era, by the time I was in elementary school in 1950, Poland was part of the Soviet bloc, and it tended to be relegated and almost forgotten. So it disappeared for 10 or so years. So the role may be there more in its absence than in its presence in that post-war era.
Peter Wisniewski asks, were the covers that you highlighted, were these on international covers or the US edition or both? Were there any distinctions?
That is a very good question. They're not always the same. In my case, these are all American issue covers. And I don't have the equivalents that were printed in Paris. The international edition was associated with Paris. Good question. I need to look at that. How did the emphasis change? First rate. I love it.
Alan Hall asked if you can talk a bit about anti-Semitism in Poland after World War II.
Okay, again, an extraordinarily sensitive topic. First of all, everyone needs to know 91% of the Jewish citizens of Poland were killed. They died unnaturally in some fashion. So that is an absolute fact. We can number it pretty closely. It's 3 million out of 3,300,000 or so. So died unnaturally by every conceivable method. And there are, in some cases, some Poles who outed them, if you will. These Poles are anathema to most Polish citizens. The Schmalcownicy, they're called, Schmalcownik. And after World War II, there was a scramble, and you have to remember everyone was being moved around. The Poles lost territories in the east, so there were 1.8 million Polish citizens who had lived in these eastern territories that were removed by the Yalta agreements. And they were put over on the Western age. The old joke is, where do you study Eastern Polish dialects? Well, Western Poland, of course. They were plunked down, just shifted bodily westward. People from Lwów were put in Wrocław. People from Wilno were put in Gdańsk and Szczecin. So vast numbers of people are being moved around. So whose house is whose? People had been thrown out, literally, all the way across. But there was competition. And meanwhile, by the time some few Jews, maximum 300,000, I think it's a good deal less than that, were trying to return to Poland, they found that Polish refugees from some other area were in occupation of the houses that they had left, if those houses even still existed. So there was resentment. Everybody was trying to hold on to every pot and pan he could get his hands on, much less a house. So there was a good deal of tension, yes. I am not a partisan of some sort of endemic Polish anti-Semitism. I don't think it exists. And the obvious background for that is the reception that Poles gave to Jews in the 14th century. Yiddish is a Rhineland dialect, and Kazimierz the Great, with his famous Esterka, his Jewish mistress, is supposed to be this great savior of the Jews. All of that does not change the fact that economic competition in the late 19th century, because the cities and the middle classes were heavily Jewish in 1870, 1875. And the Polish National Democrats were representatives of Polish nationalism and specifically wanted to create a Polish, i.e. Roman Catholic, middle class. And that brought them into economic conflict with the Jewish element that was already in place. A very strong element that the Jews of Poland were maybe at home. This is 1931, 1921 censuses, etc. It's normally given as 90% of Jewish households in Poland spoke Yiddish at home. 10% spoke Polish and were 110% Polish in every way. Culturally, even politically, great number of conversions, etc. So it's a very mixed question. And if I were Jewish, I probably would have wanted to get out as well, which is what happened. This pogrom in Kielce in 1946. This is probably what she's referring to. There are a number of other instances. Most regrettable, that's still a subject of a good deal of controversy. The police were involved, or as the case may be, not involved in this. In other words, they took no steps to quell this problem at the very beginning. So the origins and the course of action are still somewhat mysterious.
Great. We are out of time, Mark, I'm afraid, but let me answer a question that came in about the next seminar on Poland.
Okay, no problem.
And that will be November 16th with Professor Norman Davies, who will be talking about, if I remember the title correctly, the changing political landscapes in Europe, Poland's role. So more information will be forthcoming about that. Mark, I'm tremendously grateful to you for joining us today.
I'm honored by being associated with Norman Davies in any way.
well, you kicked off this series and you'll be followed by him. So we're thrilled that you were able to join us this morning. Again, my thanks to our tremendous co-sponsors and partners in this, in particular, the American Institute of Polish Culture, and of course, Blanka Rosenstiel for her support for this lecture series on Poland. This has been the history of Poland as seen through the cover of Time magazine. And joining us today has been Mark Fountain, the Honorary Consul of the Republic of Poland in North Carolina. Mark, thanks again. I'm David Kramer with Florida International University, Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs here in Miami. Thanks so much for joining us. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but please join us again November 16th. And I should say one last thing. Tomorrow we have an event on the U.S. elections as seen through the eyes of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The head of mission here in the United States for the OSCE will be joining us 10 a.m. tomorrow for a conversation. Join us then. Mark, thanks so much again and very best wishes to you. Stay healthy.
My honor.
Thanks very much, Rico and Andre. Really